My name is Major Violet Hines, and I'm 32 years old. In the United States military, there's an unwritten rule. Respect is earned in blood and sweat. But in my very first briefing at Naval Base San Diego, Admiral Kalen Hayes, my new commander, decided to tear that rule to shreds. In front of 40 officers, he swatted my presentation aside. He looked at me, not as a major, but as an annoying little girl. With a smirk, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Thanks for the cute theories, sweetie. But maybe you should leave the tactical analysis to the men. This isn't a garden club." The room filled with a few awkward, stifled chuckles. A knot formed in my throat, but I stood my ground, ramrod straight. He didn't know that he had just insulted the one person who saved his own brother's life 7 years ago. And he had no idea that I wasn't about to let this go. If you've ever been dismissed, ever been pushed aside just for being who you are, let me know in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe. Because this is the story of how one soldier taught an admiral the true meaning of respect. When the forced chuckles died out, the silence that followed was 1,000 times worse. It was a thick, heavy blanket that smothered the air in the briefing room. I could feel 40 pairs of eyes on me, a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. Some were curious, trying to gauge my reaction. Some were pitiful, a look I despised more than open hostility. And some were smug, satisfied. I didn't look at any of them. I focused on a single point on the far wall, a small scuff mark on the sterile, off-white paint. My entire world narrowed to that single point, a tiny anchor in a sea of humiliation. My training kicked in, a lifetime of discipline taking over my body. Shoulders back, chin up, breathe. Don't let them see a crack in the armor. I could feel my own heartbeat, a frantic solitary drum against my ribs, a lonely battle rhythm in a room that had suddenly declared me the enemy. Admiral Kalen Hayes continued the briefing as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just professionally executed me in front of my new command. His voice droned on about operational readiness and deployment schedules, but to me, it sounded like the slow, grinding screech of metal on glass, setting my teeth on edge. I remained standing by the podium, motionless, a living statue in the middle of a storm he had created. In that moment, I wasn't an officer. I wasn't Major Hines, a decorated combat helicopter pilot. I was a target. A prop in his demonstration of power. The briefing finally ended. "Dismissed," Hayes barked, and the room stirred to life. Chairs scraped against the floor, binders snapped shut. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the officers, but it was a relief I couldn't share. As they filed out, they moved like a school of fish parting around a rock, creating a deliberate, unspoken void around me. No one said a word. Not a single nod of acknowledgement. Lieutenant Paskins, a man who had been sitting right next to me just minutes before, suddenly became intensely focused on arranging his papers, shuffling them over and over until he could slip out a different exit, actively avoiding my path. That small act of cowardice, that blatant avoidance, stung more than the Admiral's public insult. The insult was a single, brutal blow. This was 1,000 tiny cuts. It was a clear, undeniable message, transmitted in the shared silence. You don't belong here. I walked alone down the long, echoing corridor, the sharp clicks of my regulation heels the only sound. It was a lonely, hollow sound on the polished linoleum. The wall of honor lined the hallway, filled with the official portraits of stern-faced admirals from decades past, their painted eyes seeming to follow me with silent judgment. I used to walk down hallways like this at the academy and dream of one day earning my place on such a wall. I had dreamed of a legacy built on skill and dedication. Now it felt like a walk of shame, a gallery of my failure. Each portrait was a reminder of the club I had just been publicly blackballed from. This wasn't a hall of honor, it was the corridor of my disgrace. My temporary office was more of a closet, a small windowless box with a metal desk and a single chair. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me, the slam echoing the turmoil inside my chest. For the first time since the briefing, I allowed myself to exhale, a ragged, shuddering breath that I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The recycled air tasted stale. I looked at my reflection in the small, cheap mirror hanging on the wall. The face staring back was familiar, the same sharp cheekbones, the same disciplined haircut. But the eyes were foreign. They were the eyes of a stranger, burning with a cold, contained fire I hadn't seen before. The Admiral's smirk flashed in my mind, the condescending way he'd emphasized the word, sweetie. It wasn't just a dismissal of my professional opinion. It was a deliberate stripping away of my rank, my identity, my dignity. It was designed to reduce me to a gender, to put me in a box that had nothing to do with my capabilities. I reached up and unbuttoned the collar of my uniform jacket, the crisp fabric suddenly feeling suffocating. As I shrugged it off, it felt impossibly heavy, like a suit of armor that had failed in battle. A wave of pure, hot rage began to rise from the pit of my stomach, burning its way up my throat. I wanted to scream. I wanted to put my fist through the drywall. But then, my father's voice echoed in my memory, as clear as if he were standing right there. When the engine screams, you keep a cool head, Vi. Anger is turbulence. It'll bring you down. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms, and forced the anger back down. Discipline. Control. I slumped into the chair and stared at the blank wall opposite me. The featureless beige paint began to blur, and my mind drifted away from the sterile confines of San Diego. It drifted north, far north. My mind was in Anchorage. I could almost feel the clean, sharp bite of the Arctic air, a stark contrast to the stuffy, filtered air of the base. I remembered the profound silence of a heavy snowfall, the only sound the soft hiss of the wind over ice. I remembered the feeling of freedom, of soaring in my Black Hawk over the vast, jagged expanse of a glacier, the machine and extension of my own body. Up there, in that endless white and blue, the sky didn't judge. The helicopter didn't care that I was a woman. The controls only demanded skill, precision, and nerve, things I had in abundance. They called my assignment to Alaska a hardship tour, a place where careers went to die in the cold. But I realize now, sitting in this suffocating little room, that it hadn't been a prison. It had been my sanctuary. The transfer orders to San Diego had felt like a promotion, a step up. Now they felt like a death sentence to that peace I had found. I wondered, sitting there in the echoing silence, if Kalen Hayes had any idea who I was, if he'd even bothered to read my file. Or was it simpler than that? Did he just hate the very idea of a woman in his world, a disruption to his precious garden club? Either way, it didn't matter. He had fired the first shot. The battle had just begun. My first week of work was a masterclass in silence. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a heavy, calculated absence of words, a series of turned backs and averted eyes that spoke louder than any insult. I had become a ghost in the hallways, a phantom in my own command. The most predictable performance occurred daily at the coffee station, a cramped alcove that served the bitter, burnt coffee standard in any government building. The moment I stepped in, any lively conversation among the other officers would die instantly, replaced by an awkward shuffling of feet and a sudden, intense interest in the sugar packets. After a beat, they'd resume, but the topic would be painfully neutral. The weather. Last night's baseball scores. Anything but tactics, strategy, or work. I could feel the whispers at my back as I walked away, a prickling sensation on my neck. I never turned around. In the formal meetings, the hostility was more refined, wielded with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel by Admiral Hayes himself. When it was my turn to speak, to offer analysis or input, his attention would drift. He'd gaze out the window at the palm trees swaying in the San Diego sun, or he'd glance down at his watch with a theatrical sigh of impatience, as if my voice were a minor annoyance he was forced to endure. The message was clear. My contributions were worthless. The culmination of this quiet war happened on Thursday. During a planning session for a complex training exercise, I presented a multi-point plan for integrating air and sea assets, focusing on new protocols that could significantly reduce response times. I was proud of it. It was thorough, innovative, and based on my direct combat experience. Hayes listened with a blank face. An hour later, a captain named Mark, a man known more for his golf handicap than his tactical acumen, represented the core elements of my plan as his own, using slightly different phrasing. He stumbled through the details, but the concept was undeniably mine. Hayes leaned forward, a broad smile spreading across his face. He let Mark finish, then clapped him heartily on the shoulder. "Good job, son," he boomed, his voice resonating with paternal approval. "Now that's the kind of forward thinking we do here." He looked around the room, making eye contact with everyone but me. I just sat there, my pen still poised over my notepad, and watched my work, my intellect, be publicly stolen and handed to someone else. Mark caught my eye for a split second, a flicker of smug triumph in his gaze before he looked away. My blood ran cold. This was the system. This was the good old boys club in action. Friday arrived, and with it, the palpable buzz of the weekend. I heard the men talking in low, excited tones about beer call. It was a sacred tradition, an unofficial but mandatory social gathering at MCP's Irish pub over in Coronado. I knew the place by reputation, an old-school, wood-paneled pub famous for being the unofficial headquarters for Navy SEALs. It was more than just a bar. It was where alliances were forged, where trust was built over pints of beer, where the real decisions were often made. It was the inner sanctum. And I was not invited. At 4 o'clock, the offices began to empty. The quiet hum of computers was replaced by the sounds of jovial backslapping and laughter echoing from the parking lot. I sat at my desk, staring at a stack of reports I'd already read twice, listening to the sounds of their camaraderie fade into the distance. The silence they left behind was profound, a testament to my exclusion. This wasn't a loud public humiliation like the first briefing. This was a quiet, deliberate cut. A carefully worded statement that I was not one of them, that I wasn't worthy of breaking bread or sharing a beer with the men of this command. I finally packed my briefcase and walked out to my car. On the drive back to my sterile, temporary apartment, I took the bridge to Coronado. I drove slowly past MCP's. Through the big bay window, I could see them. A crowd of officers in civilian clothes laughing, raising their glasses in a toast. A tight-knit brotherhood, sealed off from the outside world. I was a major in the United States military, but looking at them through that window, I felt like a lonely kid on the outside of a party, peering in at a life I could never be a part of. That evening, the loneliness of my small apartment felt suffocating. I was reheating a sad, frozen dinner in the microwave when my phone buzzed. An unknown number from a Texas area code. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Hines," I said, my voice flat. "Major, it's Alvarez." The name hit me like a splash of cold water. Al, my former gunner from the Bering Ridge mission. The calmest man I'd ever known under fire. "Al," I breathed, a genuine smile touching my lips for the first time in a week. "What are you doing calling me?" "Heard you got transferred to San Diego," he said, his voice a familiar, gravelly comfort. "Just wanted to call and see if you were doing okay. That place is full of sharks, Major." His simple, unprompted concern was like a canteen of cool water in the middle of a desert. To hear the voice of someone who had been beside me in the eye of the storm, someone who knew me not as Sweetie but as Reaper Zero, the pilot who got them home, it was a powerful reminder of who I really was. It was a lifeline. "I'm fine, Al," I lied, the words tasting like ash. "Just getting settled in." We talked for a few more minutes about his auto repair shop in El Paso, about his kids. It was a brief, normal conversation, and it was the best thing that had happened to me since I'd landed. On Monday morning, I was the first one in the office, a habit born from years of needing to be ahead of the day. As I approached my desk, I saw it, a thin, plain manila folder sitting squarely in the center of my blotter. There was no note, no label. My first thought was that it was some kind of administrative prank. I opened it cautiously. Inside wasn't a joke, but a printed copy of the flight safety protocols for the squadron. And all over the pages, circled in neat, precise red ink, were the exact structural weaknesses and procedural flaws I had tried to point out in my disastrous first briefing. Someone had not only listened, they had understood. My heart began to beat a little faster. I flipped to the last page. There, at the bottom, in small, clean block letters, was a handwritten note. I read your report. They were wrong. LM. LM. My mind raced through the roster. Lexi Moore, the young, quiet lieutenant who always sat in the back of the briefing room, the one who never spoke but always seemed to be taking everything in. I looked around the empty, silent office. The first rays of the morning sun were just beginning to filter through the blinds. And for the first time since setting foot in San Diego, I felt like I wasn't entirely alone. Lexi Moore's note sat on my desk, a small island of validation in a sea of hostility. They were wrong. 4 simple words, but they were enough to break the dam. My mind, untethered from the oppressive present of San Diego, was pulled back in time, back to a place where right and wrong were measured in skill and survival, not in politics and prejudice. The beige walls of my office dissolved, and I was no longer smelling stale, recycled air. I was smelling salt and ice, and I could hear the wind. It wasn't just a wind, it was a living, breathing monster. The sound of it screaming across the Bering Strait 7 years ago was a sound I'd never forget. It was a physical force that rattled the teeth and vibrated deep in your bones. On my radar screen, there was nothing but a chaotic, swirling green snowstorm of interference. The mission was a search and rescue for a 6-man SEAL team, callsign Echo 1, whose boat had capsized near a remote ice floe. But the weather had turned biblical. The voice from command crackled through my headset, shredded by static. Abort mission, Reaper 0. I repeat, abort, that's a kill zone. You are ordered to return to base. The order was logical. It was safe. But through the static, I could hear another signal. A faint, desperate pulse on a secure channel. The emergency beacon from Echo 1. They were still alive. Barely. I looked at the fuel gauge, then at the wall of black, churning cloud ahead of us. Every instinct, every regulation, screamed at me to turn back. But my gut, the part of a pilot that operates beyond the manual, told me something else. If we wait, Command, we'll be recovering bodies, I said into my mic, my voice steady, betraying none of the storm raging inside my chest. My hand moved on its own, pushing the collective forward, urging the Black Hawk not into the storm, but through it. Beside me, my gunner, Sergeant Alvarez, didn't flinch. He just keyed his mic and said one thing. Copy that, Major. It wasn't just an acknowledgement. It was absolute faith. That flight wasn't flying. It was a brawl. The Black Hawk, a powerful, robust machine, was thrown around the sky like a child's toy in a tantrum. One moment, we were plunged hundreds of feet in a violent downdraft that sent my stomach into my throat. The next, we were thrust upwards with enough force to strain the rotor blades. Freezing rain and sea spray hammered the windscreen, instantly turning to a thick sheet of ice, blinding us. I had to fly so low that I could taste the salt of the monstrous icy waves crashing just below our skids, their peaks reaching for us like grasping claws. Navigation instruments were useless. I was flying on instinct, using the faint, ghostly light of the moon reflecting off the ice floes as my only guide. I was flying by the feel of the machine in my hands, a connection between pilot and aircraft that no simulator can teach you. Then, a sudden streak of red tracer fire ripped through the darkness from below, followed an instant later by the horrifying shriek of tearing metal. We'd been hit. Sparks erupted from the main console, and the cockpit filled with the acrid smell of burning electronics. Red lights flashed across the board. Hydraulics are gone, Alvarez yelled, his voice tight but controlled. We're losing pressure. The cyclic stick in my hand went heavy, unresponsive, like it was set in concrete. The aircraft began to lurch violently towards the sea. I threw every ounce of my strength, my entire body weight, into wrestling with the controls. I became a part of the machine, my muscles the new hydraulics, my will the only thing keeping this wounded metal bird from plunging into the Pacific's graveyard. By some miracle, I found them. 6 exhausted figures in tactical gear huddled behind a ridge of ice, their forms barely visible against the swirling snow. They were on the verge of collapse. The first man to look up was their leader, Lieutenant Michael Hayes. Even in the dim, chaotic light of our landing lamp, I could see the relief flood his ice-caked face. "You came!" he screamed over the roar of the wind and the groaning of my dying helicopter. My voice was firm, a promise delivered through the storm. Always. Landing that crippled Black Hawk on that uneven, fractured slab of ice was a feat that aviation experts would later describe in official reports as technically impossible. I didn't have time to think about the technicalities. I just did it. Alvarez laid down covering fire as the team scrambled aboard, their bodies so cold they were practically frozen solid, but they were alive. All 6 of them. On the brutal flight back, with the helicopter screaming in protest with every mile, Michael Hayes unstrapped himself and came forward to the cockpit. He took off his helmet, revealing a shock of wet, sandy blonde hair and bright, earnest eyes that seemed out of place in this hellscape. He leaned in close to be heard over the engine. "My brother's an officer, too," he shouted with a grin, a genuine boyish pride in his voice. "Admiral Hayes, he's the best there is." I just nodded, my entire being focused on keeping us in the air, on getting these men home. I registered his words, but they were just data points in the storm. It was only later that they would come back to haunt me. 7 months later, the news arrived. Lieutenant Michael Hayes was killed in action during a mission in Kachemak Bay, Alaska. A mission that went wrong in bad weather. A mission commanded by his brother. The call sign, Reaper 0, was officially given to me after that rescue. A general pinned a medal on my chest and said, "It's because you flew through hell and brought back men who were already considered dead." But for me, the name always carried a different weight. It was a constant, searing reminder. Michael Hayes died, and I didn't. I was the survivor. And I learned that day, in the cold, unforgiving skies of the North, that survival isn't always a victory. Sometimes it's a life sentence. Admiral Hayes no longer bothered with direct public insults. The open hostility of the first briefing was replaced by something far more insidious. The war had gone cold, shifting from overt attacks to a covert campaign of psychological warfare, and he was a master of it. He was rewriting history, and I was the villain of his new narrative. His weapon of choice was a mandatory risk management training session he held for all senior staff. And the primary case study? Mission Bering Ridge. "Sometimes," he began, pacing slowly in front of the projection screen, his voice calm and authoritative, "mission success is not a product of skill, but of blind luck." His eyes scanned the room and settled on me for a fraction of a second, just long enough to ensure his point was made. An inexperienced pilot, disregarding a direct order, happens to succeed through sheer chance. We cannot build reliable strategy on such random occurrences. The words were like a slow-acting poison, seeping into the minds of everyone present. He didn't just deny my skill, he twisted my courage into foolish recklessness, my definitive success into an accidental anomaly. He was expertly erasing the truth of Reaper 0 and replacing it with a cautionary tale. I sat perfectly still, my face a neutral mask, taking notes in my logbook as if I were studying an abstract tactical problem. But beneath the calm exterior, a cold, hard decision had formed. This was no longer just about my career. This was about the truth. I had to find out what really happened in Kachemak Bay. My alliance with Lexi Moore solidified in the shadows. We operated like spies in our own command, communicating through encrypted personal emails and meeting at a small independent coffee shop in La Jolla, far from the prying eyes of the base. It was a cozy place that smelled of roasted coffee beans and pastries, a world away from the sterile, tense atmosphere of our offices. Lexi, with her logistics officer clearance, had access to different layers of the system and became my eyes and ears, my partner in this silent insurrection. "Everyone is afraid of him," she admitted one afternoon, stirring her latte, her eyes darting nervously towards the door. "But they also respect you. You're Reaper 0. What he's doing, it's not right." Her quiet loyalty was a powerful antidote to the isolation I felt. That day, sitting across from her, I realized I wasn't fighting alone anymore. I was fighting for her too, and for all the others who were too afraid to speak up. It was during that same week, late one night while scrolling through my tablet, that I stumbled upon a talk by Brené Brown, the famous researcher. She was talking about courage. Courage, she said, is about speaking your truth, no matter how much your voice shakes. My own voice had been silenced, so I would have to find my truth another way. That resolution led me to the base archives. It was a flagrant violation of every protocol, but it was a risk I had to take. Late at night, long after the last cleaning crew had gone home, I used my security clearance card to slip into the records facility. The room was kept at a constant, chilly temperature, and the only sounds were the low, electronic hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the soft rustle of my own movements. The air was thick with the dry, dusty smell of old paper and ink, the scent of buried history. My target was the mission file for Operation Frost Serpent, the official name for the Kachmak Bay incident that took Michael's life. As I expected, the file had been sanitized. Most of the critical documents, after-action reports, threat assessments, were either missing or heavily redacted. Thick black lines, the work of an official redaction pen, covered entire paragraphs, leaving behind a mockery of a report. But I didn't give up. My father's voice echoed in my head, a lesson from my childhood spent fixing engines with him in our garage in Iowa. Always check the small stuff, Vi. The devil's in the details. So I went through every single page, my gloved fingers carefully turning the brittle paper. I was looking for anything. An anomaly. A smudge of ink. A coffee stain. Anything out of place. For hours, I found nothing. Discouragement began to set in. Maybe he had been thorough. Maybe the truth was gone forever. And then, I saw it. It was in a communications log, a dry, minute-by-minute record of radio traffic. One line, time-stamped just before the mission went critical, was blacked out. But unlike the other redactions, this one was different. The ink wasn't as thick. Holding my small tactical flashlight at an angle, I could just make out the faintest trace of letters underneath, the indentation left by the pressure of the pen on the page. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. I remembered an old intelligence trick. I carefully took a thin sheet of paper from a nearby printer and a pencil from my pocket. Placing the paper over the redacted line, I began to gently shade the area with the side of the pencil lead. My hand was shaking, but I forced it steady. Slowly, like ghosts emerging from the fog, the indented letters began to appear. First, a P, then an I, L, O, T. Pilot recommends abort. My breath caught in my throat. I kept shading, my movements now frantic. Overruled by Co. Overruled by the commanding officer. My mind raced. I quickly pulled up the mission's command structure on my secure tablet. There was only one person who could have held that title that day. The commanding officer for Operation Frost Serpent was Admiral Kaylin Hayes. I leaned back against a cold metal shelf, the reality crashing down on me with physical force. It all made sense. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Michael hadn't died because of a storm or a mechanical failure. He died because his own brother, blinded by ambition or arrogance, had overruled a pilot's direct recommendation to abort. Kaylin Hayes had sent his brother to his death, and his vicious, systematic campaign to destroy my career, to paint me as a reckless, lucky amateur. It was never about me. It was a cover-up. He wasn't just trying to silence me. He was trying to erase his own guilt. The moment I discovered the truth in that cold, silent archive room, a timer started ticking. I didn't know it then, but my small act of defiance had tripped a silent alarm deep within the system, and the system was now moving against me. The first casualty wasn't me. It was Lexi. The very next day, she called me, her voice a frantic whisper over a bad connection. Vi, I've got orders. Emergency orders. What? Where? I asked, a cold dread washing over me. Guam, she said, and the word hung in the air like a death sentence. Guam. A remote Pacific outpost. It was a career dead end, and we both knew it. The official reason was a special operational requirement, a vague catch-all term that meant nothing and everything. It's a punishment, Vi. A warning, she whispered, her voice trembling. They know. They're watching us. Be careful. The line went dead. Not a disconnect, but a clean, sudden click. The call was cut. A chilling sense of dread crept up my spine. Kalen wasn't just defending his position anymore, he was on the attack. And he had just taken my only ally off the board, hitting me where I was most vulnerable, through the people I cared about. The fear I felt was now laced with a heavy, bitter guilt. I knew I had to move fast. That night, I went back to the archives, my objective simple. Photograph the comms log page. I needed a clear, undeniable copy of the evidence. I slid my keycard. The door clicked open, and I slipped inside, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I navigated the maze of shelves back to the file for Operation Frost Serpent, file number 214. My hands were shaking as I opened the folder. I flipped to the comms log section, to the exact page I'd found the night before. But it wasn't there. The page was gone. An empty space remained, a void where the truth used to be. Someone had gotten here first. The silence of the room, once a comfort, now felt menacing. Every shadow seemed to shift, and I had the unnerving sensation of being watched from between the towering shelves of forgotten files. I backed away slowly, then turned and left, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty hall. This was no longer an investigation. The war had escalated into a desperate race against time. The next morning, the trap was sprung. I walked into my office at 0700, coffee in hand, ready to start my day, only to find two base security officers waiting for me. They stood at parade rest, their uniforms immaculate, their expressions as cold and hard as granite. "Major Hines," the older one said, his voice devoid of any warmth or respect. There was no greeting, no preamble. "On the Admiral's authority, you are to surrender your security pass and all government-issued electronic devices. You are officially under investigation by the Judge Advocate General's Corps for violation of security protocols and unauthorized access of classified materials." JAG. The word hit me like a physical blow. The military's legal arm. An investigation like this could end a career in a heartbeat. They offered no further explanation. They didn't have to. Their detached professional demeanor treated me not as a fellow officer, but as a common criminal. Through the glass walls of my office, I could see my colleagues watching, their faces a mixture of curiosity and fear. As I was escorted out of the building, a box with my personal effects in my arms, their eyes followed me. No one said a word. The silence was an indictment. The isolation was now absolute. I was suspended from duty, my movements restricted to the base. My life shrank to the four walls of my temporary quarters. That evening, unable to bear the confinement, I went for a walk through the deserted base grounds. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the empty parade grounds. As I passed a darkened parking lot, a black sedan with civilian plates pulled up silently beside me. The tinted rear window slid down with a soft whir. A man in a plain gray suit sat in the back, his face impassive, his eyes like chips of ice. He didn't look like a military man. He looked like something else entirely. "Major," he said, his voice a flat, toneless monotone. "There are some wars you can't win. Some truths are not meant to be known. Sometimes the best way to serve your country is to remain silent." He paused, letting the words sink in. "It's also the best way to protect yourself." The window slid up. The car's engine purred to life, and it pulled away, disappearing into the night as silently as it had arrived. It wasn't advice. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat delivered with the cold, impersonal weight of an entire institution. The system had finally spoken, and its message was clear: drop it or be crushed. The message came through a burner phone, a single sterile text with a time and a location. Coronado Beach, sunset. No signature, but I knew. The inevitable confrontation was here, but not in a sterile hearing room where rank would be his shield. He wanted to meet on neutral ground, on the edge of the continent, far from the prying ears of the base. I saw him from a distance, a solitary figure near the water's edge. The California sun was bleeding across the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, silhouetting the distant Point Loma Peninsula. He wasn't the imposing admiral I'd faced in the briefing room. Stripped of his uniform, in a simple polo shirt and khakis, Kalen Hayes looked smaller, older, and profoundly tired. The sharp, authoritative lines of his posture had softened into a slump. The weight of his rank had been replaced by a different, heavier burden, one that seemed to physically press him down. As I walked towards him, the salty air whipped hair across my face. My heart was a steady drum in my chest. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times, arming myself with facts and a cold fury. But seeing him there, so utterly defeated against the backdrop of a beautiful, indifferent sunset, threw me off balance. I walked up and stood beside him, leaving a few feet of empty space between us. For a long moment, we just watched the Pacific waves roll in and collapse, the rhythmic sound filling the silence. "You won," he finally said, his voice a hoarse rasp, as raw and broken as driftwood. "You got what you wanted. You found it." I kept my eyes on the horizon. "I didn't want anything," I replied, my voice surprisingly steady. "Except the truth." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped him. "The truth," he repeated, shaking his head. "You think you're the only one haunted by ghosts every night, Major?" He turned to face me, and in the fading light, I could see the deep, hollowed-out pain in his eyes. This wasn't a strategic move. This was a complete and total surrender. "I was in the command center that day," Kalen began, his voice cracking, the walls of his authority crumbling. "I saw all of it. The weather data getting worse by the minute, the desperate warnings from the pilot, but that mission, it was my ticket to another star. My ambition was a runaway train. I was arrogant, his gaze fixed on some terrible memory. I thought I could control the storm." He paused, swallowing hard against a grief that was 7 years old but still raw. "When I got the call that the chopper was down, the first order I gave wasn't for search and rescue. It was to seal the records, to contain the damage to my career." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "I chose my career over my brother." The confession hung in the air between us. He told me he stood at Michael's funeral in his immaculate dress uniform, a rigid shell of duty, accepting condolences. He hadn't shed a single tear, not because he didn't feel a grief so vast it threatened to swallow him whole, but because he felt he no longer had the right to. The anger I had carried for weeks, the indignation that fueled my every action, began to cool, replaced by a cold, aching sorrow. This was worse than I had ever imagined. "But that's not the whole story," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small black USB drive. It looked insignificant, but I knew it was the heart of this tragedy. "This is from Michael's personal black box, a small audio recorder he always carried. I've had it for 7 years. He held it out to me. His hand, the same one that had dismissed me, was trembling. "I haven't been running from my guilt, Major. I've been running from something else." His eyes were filled with a torment so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. I hesitated for a long second. What could be worse than what he'd confessed? I reached out and took the drive. It was small and light, but it felt impossibly heavy, like it contained the weight of a soul. Back in the suffocating quiet of my temporary quarters, the only light came from my laptop screen. My aunt, a devout woman from Iowa, used to quote the Bible to me, "The truth will set you free." But as I slid the USB drive into the port and clicked on the single audio file, I started to wonder. Free for whom? The recording was pure chaos, an assault of sound, the terrifying roar of wind, the high-pitched scream of stressed metal, the cacophony of alarms. I could almost feel the violent lurch of the aircraft. Through it all, I heard the pilot's urgent, professional voice, his words clipped, recommending they abort immediately. Then, Kalen's voice, clear and cold over the comms, overruling the request. Then static, a harsh, tearing sound. And then, a new voice, faint but clear, a human sound cutting through the mechanical noise. It was Michael Hayes, speaking to the pilot, his words strained, broken, fighting for every breath. "Tell my brother, Tell him not to blame himself, Michael gasped, his voice thin and reedy against the storm. And tell him. The pilot? She did everything right. She tried. The recording ended abruptly in a final, deafening burst of static that felt like a scream. I sat there, frozen, staring at the blank screen. The silence in the room was absolute. My meticulously constructed case, my righteous anger, my relentless quest for justice, it all dissolved in that single, selfless moment. It shattered, leaving behind only a vast, hollow ache in my chest. Kalen Hayes wasn't running from an accusation. He was running from his brother's forgiveness. A pardon he could never accept. A grace he felt he would never, ever deserve. If you believe Michael's final words should be honored, press that like button. And if you've ever had to carry a difficult truth, just comment with the word witness below. Let me know I'm not alone in this. My mission had been to find a monster. Instead, I'd found a broken man, haunted not by his crime, but by the unconditional love of the brother he had failed. And now, the truth was mine to carry. But it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a cage. Sleep did not come that night. It couldn't. The small, sterile room of my temporary quarters felt like a pressure cooker for my thoughts, and the silence was filled with the ghost of a voice from a dying helicopter. I must have played the recording a dozen times, maybe more. Each time, I listened to the storm, the alarms, the final selfless words of Michael Hayes, and each time, the same question echoed in the devastating silence that followed. What now? The path I had started on was clear, paved with righteous anger. I had set out to find justice for myself, to expose a corrupt and arrogant man who had tried to destroy me to protect himself. The evidence I now held in my hand, the original log, Kalen's confession, this haunting recording, was more than enough to achieve that. I could obliterate him. I could end his career, strip him of his rank, and turn him into a public example of failed leadership. By every military and legal definition, that would be justice. It would be a clean, decisive victory. But as Michael's voice, forgiving and calm in the face of death, played over and over in my mind, the very definition of justice began to warp and shift. What would destroying Kalen truly accomplish? Would it bring peace to Michael's memory? Would it bring peace to me? Or would it just be another act of destruction in a story already filled with so much loss? I was holding the fate of a broken man in my hands, and the weight of that power was more suffocating than any threat he had ever made against me. The clear black and white lines of my mission had bled into an impossible shade of gray. At dawn, with the first pale light filtering into the room, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my mother back in Iowa. I didn't tell her the details, of course. I couldn't. I just told her I was facing a difficult decision about a superior officer, one that could define the rest of my career. She listened patiently on the other end of the line, the way she always did, letting the silence stretch. I could picture her sitting at her kitchen table, a cup of coffee in her hand, looking out over the endless cornfields that stretched to the horizon. "Well, Vi," she finally said, her voice gentle and pragmatic, infused with the simple, unshakable wisdom of the Midwest. "I don't know a thing about the military, but I do know people. Your father, he always used to say that it's more valuable to fix a broken engine than it is to just toss it in the scrapyard." She paused for a moment. Maybe people are the same way. Her words weren't a solution, but they were a signpost. After I hung up, I walked over to the small dresser and picked up the simple silver ring I always kept there. It had been my father's. He was a Boeing engineer, a man who lived by the laws of physics and tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. He wore this ring every day of his working life. I slipped it onto my thumb, the cool metal a familiar weight. I could almost hear his voice, a constant refrain from my childhood. "Precision, Violet, precision is a form of respect." For my entire career, I had interpreted that as a call to follow the rules, to execute maneuvers flawlessly, to be technically perfect. But as I stood there, turning the ring on my finger, I understood it differently for the first time. Precision wasn't just about flawless execution, it was about a correct diagnosis. My father didn't just replace parts. He understood why they failed. He respected the machine enough to understand its complexities. And that was it. My diagnosis of the problem had been wrong. The problem wasn't that Kalen Hayes was an evil man. The problem was that he was a catastrophic failure as a leader and a brother. A man so consumed by guilt and ambition that he had become a danger to everyone around him. Punishing him, destroying him, would just be creating another piece for the scrapyard. It would be an act of anger, not precision. But what if there was a way to fix it? To take the broken parts of this tragedy and turn them into a lesson? To respect the profound loss enough to ensure it was never repeated? It was a concept I'd read about, restorative justice, a philosophy that focused on healing and repair rather than just punishment. My choice became clear. The knot in my stomach loosened. I sat down at my laptop. My hearing was in 2 days. I opened a new document and began to write my final report. I laid out all the facts with the cold precision my father would have admired. Hayes's public humiliation of me, my covert investigation, the evidence he tried to destroy, his full confession on the beach, and the final exonerating words of his brother from the cockpit recording. I attached the audio file. It was a complete and damning account. But when I got to the final section, recommendations, I didn't call for a court-martial. I didn't demand his resignation. Instead, my fingers typed out a different kind of sentence. Recommendation that Admiral Kalen Hayes be reassigned to a teaching position at the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. It is proposed that he be tasked with developing and instructing a new core curriculum course for senior midshipmen, tentatively titled Ethical Leadership and Command Responsibility Under Pressure. I leaned back, reading the words on the screen. The most expensive lesson Kalen Hayes ever learned, a lesson paid for with his brother's life, should not be buried with him in disgrace. It had to be shared. It had to be the shield that would protect the next generation of sailors and officers. That, I decided, was the only form of justice Michael Hayes would have wanted. The room was exactly as I had pictured it, cold, imposing, and utterly devoid of warmth. It wasn't a courtroom, but an official hearing room, paneled in dark wood that seemed to absorb all the light. The air was still and thick with a palpable tension, the kind of formal, suffocating silence unique to places of high military power. 3 generals sat on a raised dais behind a long polished table, their faces impassive, chiseled from stone. They were the arbiters of my fate, a tribunal of living monuments. The American flag and the Navy flag stood on either side of them, silent, powerful witnesses. I sat at a small table on one side of the room, my back ramrod straight, my hands resting calmly on the file in front of me. At an identical table on the other side sat Kalen Hayes. He was back in his full-dress uniform, adorned with ribbons and stars, but it looked like a costume he no longer fit into. It hung on him like a shell, the man inside having already collapsed. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on nothing. The presiding general, a 3-star with a chest full of commendations and a face etched with the gravity of command, finally broke the silence. His voice was a low, even baritone, completely neutral. Major Hines, he began, his eyes on the file before him. You are the subject of an Article 32 hearing to investigate allegations of violating security protocols, unauthorized access of classified materials, and insubordination. These are severe charges. You are now invited to make a statement. Every eye in the room turned to me. I stood up, my movements deliberate and measured. I felt their gazes, curious, skeptical, some perhaps even hostile. I smoothed the front of my own crisp uniform and met the eyes of the 3 generals on the dais. Generals, I started, my voice clear and steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. I am not here today to defend my actions. I am here to explain them. The report before you details every charge against me, and I do not dispute them. I did access classified materials without authorization. I did operate outside the established chain of command. I paused, letting the weight of my admission settle in the silent room. I broke the rules, I continued, my gaze unwavering. But I did so because I believed a greater truth needed to be brought to light, a truth that involved the death of a fellow officer, Lieutenant Michael Hayes, and a truth that has direct bearing on the single most sacred principle we, as leaders, are sworn to uphold. I looked from one general to the next. That principle is that we do whatever it takes to bring our people home. It is the bedrock of trust between a soldier and his commander. That trust was broken in Kachmak Bay. I then recounted the entire story, from the first briefing room insult to the discovery in the archives. I laid it all out with the dispassionate precision of an after-action report. I detailed the systematic gaslighting, the covert investigation, the evidence that was deliberately erased. I did not, however, mention the USB drive. My promise to Kaylin was a private matter, a pact made between two survivors on a lonely beach. Michael's last words were not for a hearing, they were for his brother alone. My statement was the cold, hard skeleton of the facts. When I finished, a profound silence once again filled the room. I sat down, my part in the proceedings now over. The presiding general took a long moment, then turned his gaze from me to Kaylin. "Admiral Hayes," he said, his voice still a flat monotone. "Do you have a response to this testimony?" This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. A ripple of anticipation went through the room. They expected a denial, a furious counterattack from a powerful, cornered admiral. They expected him to tear me apart, to use his rank and reputation to discredit every word I had said. Kaylin Hayes stood up, but he did so slowly, as if his limbs were made of lead. He didn't look at the board of generals. He didn't look at the other officers in the room. He looked directly at me. "What Major Hines has stated," he began, and his voice, once so full of command and arrogance, was now broken, fragile, and utterly defeated, "is all true." A collective silent gasp seemed to be sucked out of the room. The air crackled with stunned disbelief. "I failed," he continued, his voice thick with a shame that was almost painful to witness. "I failed as a commander, and I failed as a brother. My arrogance and my ambition killed my brother, and I tried to destroy Major Hines's career and her reputation to cover up my own cowardice." He finally tore his eyes away from me and looked at the floor, his shoulders slumping forward. "That is all I have to say." He sat down, a broken man. The image of power and authority he had so carefully cultivated had been utterly demolished, not by me, but by the weight of his own confession. The three generals on the dais did not speak for what felt like an eternity. They exchanged no glances, made no signals. They simply sat in the crushing silence. Finally, the presiding general looked down at the report I had submitted, the one containing my unorthodox recommendation. He read it silently, his expression unreadable. Then, he looked up. "Major Hines," he said, his voice now carrying a different tone, a hint of something other than procedural formality. "Considering the extraordinary circumstances presented here, all charges against you are hereby dismissed." A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me. I remained perfectly still. The general then turned his gaze to Kaylin. "Admiral Hayes," he said, and now his voice was cold steel. "The board has reviewed the recommendation included in Major Hines's official report." He paused. "We concur. A mistake of this magnitude should not be buried. It must become a lesson." The verdict was delivered not with a gavel, but with the quiet finality of a sealed order. Kaylin Hayes would be administratively demoted one rank, from admiral to rear admiral. He was to be immediately transferred from his command and reassigned to the U.S. Naval Academy. His mistake was now his mission. I had walked into that room expecting a fight for my career, but I hadn't just one. Standing there, in that cold, silent room of power, I realized I had changed the ending. The days following the hearing were quiet, almost unnervingly so. The storm had passed, leaving behind a calm, clear sky and the lingering scent of ozone. The undercurrent of tension that had defined my existence at Naval Base San Diego had vanished. People met my eye in the hallways now, offering nods of respect that were no longer strained. The whispers that followed me were not of suspicion, but of awe. The story of the hearing had spread like wildfire, becoming a piece of base legend almost overnight. But for me, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a release. A few days later, I was walking down the main administrative corridor when I saw him. Kalen Hayes was coming out of his former office, carrying a cardboard box filled with personal effects. A framed picture, a few books, a coffee mug. He was no longer an admiral. He was just a man packing up his life, preparing for a new, uncertain one. An awkward silence fell between us as we met in the middle of the hallway. The ghosts of everything that had happened hung in the air, but the animosity was gone. He was the first to speak, breaking the silence with a voice that was quiet and raspy. "I'm heading to Annapolis," he said, shifting the box in his arms. He looked at me, his eyes clear of the arrogance and fury I'd once known, replaced by a weary resignation. "Thank you, Violet." It was the first time he had ever used my first name, and the sound of it was jarring, yet strangely fitting. "Not for saving me," he clarified, a flicker of his old, bitter humor surfacing. "But for not destroying me." I simply nodded. The anger I had held for so long had been a fire, but the truth had extinguished it, leaving behind not ashes, but a strange, quiet emptiness. "Someone has to teach the storm how to end, sir," I replied. The sir was a reflex, a mark of respect for the rank, if not the man. But in that moment, it felt right. He seemed to consider my words, then reached into the pocket of his trousers, pulling out a faded, yellowed envelope. "This was the last letter Michael wrote to me," he said, holding it out. "He never got to send it. I think he would have wanted you to read it." My breath caught. I looked from the letter to his face. This was more than an apology. It was an act of profound trust, a final surrender. I took the letter, my fingers brushing his. It was a final absolution, a release of the last ghost that stood between us. "Good luck in Annapolis, Rear Admiral," I said. "Good luck to you, Major," he replied. We shook hands. It wasn't the perfunctory handshake of colleagues, but a firm, meaningful grip. There was no hatred left, only a shared, devastating understanding. As he turned and walked away down the long corridor, I saw that the weight on his shoulders was no longer the crushing burden of an admiral's command, but the heavy mantle of a teacher. The letter could wait. I needed a moment, but I didn't have long. A short while later, I was summoned to the office of the 3-star general who had presided over the hearing. He gestured for me to sit down, his face as stern and unreadable as ever. "Major," he began, getting straight to the point, "we were wrong to send you here. This command wasn't ready for you." He paused, leaning forward on his desk. "But perhaps your assignment here was the best thing that could have happened to this unit. You exposed a critical failure in leadership and handled it with a level of integrity this board has rarely seen." He pushed a thick bound folder across the polished desk towards me. "We're establishing a new, mandatory training program for all prospective flight and tactical commanders," he explained. "It will focus on advanced decision-making skills, command ethics, and leadership under extreme psychological pressure. We want you to head it." I opened the folder. On the cover page, printed in bold, official font, were the words, "The Reaper Project." I looked up at him, stunned into silence. He had taken my call sign, the name born from the ice and fire of the Bering Strait, the name Kalen had tried to tarnish, and was turning it into a legacy. It was the highest form of validation, an honor that went beyond any medal. I walked out of that office and into the warm California sunshine, a feeling of profound lightness spreading through my body. The storm inside me, the one I had been flying through for months, had finally broken. I had landed. Safely. I pulled out my phone and saw a new email waiting for me. It was from Lexi. The subject line just said, "Thank you." I opened it. There was a picture of her, smiling, vibrant, and happy, standing on a beautiful beach with turquoise water behind her. It was Guam. The message was short, but it meant the world. "Vi, I heard what happened. The whole base is talking about it. They reversed my transfer orders. I'm coming home. You did it. Thank you, Reaper Zero." A genuine smile spread across my face. My mother's words echoed in my mind. The simple, honest wisdom from a world away in Iowa. Maybe she was right. Maybe, after all this, I was finally learning how to land in people's hearts. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath of the salt-tinged air, and for the first time since arriving in San Diego, I felt a sense of peace. Time has a way of smoothing the sharpest edges of memory, turning battlefields into history and wounds into scars that tell a story. The years after the hearing were marked by a quiet, profound sense of purpose. The Reaper Project became my life's work, a crucible where I poured every hard-won lesson about leadership, ethics, and grace under fire. 1 year after its inception, we held the first graduation ceremony for the program. The auditorium was filled with the Navy's brightest new commanders, their faces eager and full of the unshakable confidence of youth. I sat in the front row, now a lieutenant commander, watching them. Our special guest speaker, a man who had specifically requested the honor, was Rear Admiral Kalen Hayes. He walked to the podium, not with the arrogant swagger of the man I once knew, but with the quiet dignity of a scholar. He looked out at the sea of uniforms, his gaze landing for a moment on me. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You are taught about tactics here," he began, his voice steady and clear, resonating with a newfound authority. "You are taught about weapon systems, about strategy, about the cold calculus of naval warfare. But today I want to talk to you about courage." A hush fell over the room. "Not the courage to face an enemy," he continued, "but the far more difficult courage to face yourself, to face your own pride, your own ambition, your own fallibility. I was once a man who lacked that courage. I stood in a command center and, blinded by the pursuit of my next star, I sent my own brother into a storm he could not survive. And when a truly courageous officer tried to bring my failure to light, I used my power not to seek the truth, but to hide from it." He told them the entire story, unvarnished and unflinching. He spoke of his arrogance, his cowardice, and his attempt to destroy my career to protect his own. It was a raw, painful confession, delivered not as an apology, but as a lesson. "The person who taught me that lesson," he concluded, his eyes finding mine again, "the person who showed me that true strength isn't about never falling, but about how you stand back up, is your program director, Lieutenant Commander Violet Hines." He began to applaud, and the entire auditorium rose to its feet, the sound of their clapping echoing off the walls. It wasn't for me, not really. It was for the truth. It was for the idea that even in a system as rigid as the military, integrity could still win. Many years later, long after I'd hung up my own uniform for the last time, I found myself in Washington, D.C. I was a civilian now, a woman with graying hair and the quiet peace of a life fully lived. I walked through the cavernous halls of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, a place I had dreamed of visiting as a girl in Iowa. And there, suspended from the ceiling in a place of high honor, was my old Black Hawk. Call sign RZ-01 was painted proudly on its side, the words Reaper 0 stenciled just below the cockpit window. It looked smaller than I remembered, a sleeping metal giant, its rotors forever still. I stood before it for a long time, a silent reunion with an old friend. "Ma'am, Mrs. Hines." I turned to see a young woman standing beside me. She was in her early 20s, with kind, intelligent eyes that looked vaguely familiar. "I'm Sarah Hayes," she said with a warm smile. "My father is Kalen Hayes." My breath caught. She was the spitting image of Michael. "My dad wanted me to tell you, if I ever saw you, that he found his peace. He became a legend at Annapolis. The cadets called him the conscience of the command. He said the first lesson he ever taught, every single semester, was the story of the courage of Major Violet Hines." Tears welled in my eyes. "Thank you for telling me that, Sarah," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "There's something else," she added, her eyes shining with pride. "The Navy just commissioned its newest class of destroyers, state-of-the-art warships. They're called the Hines class." I was speechless. The weight of that honor settled over me, a legacy forged not in battle, but in the fight for a simple, unyielding truth. Later that evening, I stood on the National Mall as the sun began to set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. The Washington Monument stood before me, a brilliant white spire against the fading light. My legacy wasn't the steel machine hanging in that museum. It was in the program that was still shaping the best leaders in the Navy. It was in the young officers who served on the decks of the USS Hines. It was in a man who had found redemption and passed on its lessons. I hadn't just won back my respect, I had redefined it. A gentle breeze rustled the autumn leaves, carrying with it the distant, humming sounds of the city. I looked up at the vast, peaceful sky. It was no longer the hostile sky of a battlefield or the unforgiving gray sky of Alaska. It was just a sky, calm and endless. A slow smile spread across my face. They called me Reaper Zero. I whispered to no one but myself. But all I ever wanted was to bring everyone home. Even the ones who once hoped I hadn't made it back. That sky over the Washington Mall was the end of my story, but I know the journey is one that so many of you understand. My war wasn't fought on a foreign battlefield, but in briefing rooms and quiet hallways where dignity is often the first casualty. If my story of fighting for the truth and finding peace on the other side has resonated with you, I would be honored by your support. Please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories of resilience. In the comments below, simply type the word integrity to let me know you are here.